Welcome again in our online course on Unix operating system administration. And let's start with our first chapter, which is theoretical background and an introduction that introduce operating systems, Unix and Linux history. So, when we talk about operating systems, many operating systems have been introduced all along this century of operating systems and computers. Yet, maybe our main knowledge written only on Microsoft, which is a soft and home used operating system. So let's try to understand how those operating systems were evaluated, their principle and their terminology and idea. So first of all, let's introduce our evolution of operating systems. So the first operating system was introduced as by IBM and General Motors and for the IBM 704. It's called the GM input output. It is like introduced in here a small interface with a small interactive concepts. In 1960s, IBM tried to develop a series of operating system for its 3060 series. It was developed and abandoned, but Unix is developed as a consequence. So in 1960s, it was the launch of Unix that will be see after in the next era. So here this is the IBM MS-DOS, and which was further introduced in Microsoft. So in 1970, Unix have been introduced, which will become popular. It is a command line base where we have a black screen and only commands and set of commands to guide and instruct this machine to execute a a task. So, like here, it was mainly popular in academic circles and military. After Apple released its macOS and in 1977, and it was more secure, more elegant. We can say that by 1981, MS-DOS have improved the IBM, and by by that, all computers now, as a version in their version state, they have the MS-DOS console operating system. In 1980s, computers were not only destined for societies or academic settings or military, but home computer was introduced, and by that there was a need to produce more user friendly operating systems, like with graphical aspects that help people with lack of expertise in computer science to use this machine for their daily use. So by that, in 1991, Linux was introduced, and it was introduced by Linus Torvalds, which was based on the Unix system, and that's why Linus as his name, and he used the X for Linux, and we will see how Linux was developed further. In the 90s era, Windows tried also was introduced and dominated the laptop and desktop markets. And by its version of Windows 95, it was a hit on desktop market and home computers. Yet, yet Windows proved to fail in settings like servers, like enterprises, like with its fail in security and so on. So Unix and Linux dominated the supercomputer markets. In 2008, Android as a phone operating system was released, which was based on the Linux kernel, and by that, in 2010, smartphones became ubiquitous, which means they developed all along the world, and they used specifically Android with their Linux kernel, or macOS for Apple's iOS for Apple, and some Windows-based operating systems. And in 2011, OpenShift released by Red Hat, which is a Linux distribution. So this is the main types of operating system. Each type contains different distribution, but we will shed light only on Linux. So to have an overview on operating systems, so operating systems are a sophisticated piece of software. They act as a middleman, so we have the application and we have the hardware. How we can use how we can make this application to use the hardware is by the bridging it by operating system. So we can see that in this scheme we have the user, the set of applications, and the computer hardware. So operating systems are the bridge between the user and the hardware. So operating systems are aimed to execute program with an ease, have a certain efficiency in memory management, how to use memory to store and to execute our task or the user tasks, and to have a certain input output handling. It means what we will retain from the keyboard, from the macros, from anything, and how to deliver it within screens with our printers and so on. So operating systems also need to have a certain virtualization, which mean the OS will give each process the illusion that it has its own CPU. For example, if I am working with Word and PDF on the same time, the application, the Word application and the PDF application will have the illusion that they are the solely user for all the hardware and the processor of this computer. They also make a memory virtualization. They will provide a certain concurrency, so we will have different process to run simultaneously. For example, I will have the USB, these controllers. I'm launching Word, PDF, Chrome, or any other applications, and everything work and respond in a very small time. So we have also a persistence. So if each hardware will be work persistently without no failure from using the memory, the CPU, and everything will be connected to deliver a service. So moving now to Linux. So Linux was created from Unix. It was a conversion from Unix to Linux. It means it represents the transition from proprietary operating system to open source alternative. Unix was not open source, so it was expensive. It was not really developed. So Linux came as why not try to make an open source alternative that will have a broader impact. So Unix was developed in 1960 and the late of 1960 and 1970s at the AT&T's Bell Labs. It became widely popular in academic and commercial setting. Its property licensing made it expensive and restricted its modification. Well, Linux, it came in 1991. Linus Torvald, he was a Finnish student. He started to develop Linux, but he was inspired from Unix, but without seeing its code. So he just took the idea, the topology behind Unix, and tried to develop and simulate a free operating system. It was like unlike Unix, Linux is distributed into the general public license. It means a community that generates open source licenses. It was built from scratch but combined with free tools from the GNU project, so it was not solely developed by Linus, but he used some projects that helped him to develop it. It gained traction due to its cost effectiveness, flexibility, and community driven development. Over time, it became dominant in servers, supercomputers, and embedded systems, as well as forming the foundation of Android. It's free, it's open source, it can be modified, it can be adjusted, so it was the best choice for everything. So Linux is an operating system with many features. Mainly, it's portable, It have an hierarchical file system. It's an open source. It assures security. It assures multi-programming and multi-users, and we can use the shell for CLE and or command interface languages. So, moving to the history of Linux, Linux was first released by Linus Torvalds. It was licensed under the GNU GPL and the GNU licensing, which make it the main the main break in its success. The Slackware became first widely adopted distribution. It's the first distribution, and in 1966, Linus had visited an aquarium, had got bitten by a penguin, and he chose it as Linux mascot. So after that, the penguin was the main logo of Linux. After that, it started to attract sponsoring and plus support. Many distributions have been introduced, especially Red Hat. IBM also started to run advertisements and on Linux, especially in Super Bowl, and it appeared on the Business Week, and by that it became the dominant of Word computers and supercomputers, phones, ATMs, automats, and everything. So the architecture of Linux is mainly made of the hardware, a kernel on this hardware, a shell that help us to make an interface between the applications and the utilities. So the applications are user level programs and like Word, like PDF, like the utilities also are system tools like drivers and so on. And shell is an interface where we can try to make commands and so that the kernel will interpret them and make the hardware execute it. So, for example, let's take this scenario. First of all, we will power on our computer. Power our computer from that button. A bootloader will load the kernel, this Linux kernel. The kernel will initialize all the hardware like the keyboard, like the screen, like the processor, the RAM, everything. The init system will start necessary service, for example, like screen graphical interface, like audios, like anything needed to load this system. The system libraries and kernel modules will provide a set of functionality to the system and applications. The shell take user input, so the shell here will take the user input in order to give them to go back to the kernel and use the hardware. The user process like has and interacts with system services and hardware, same thing. And the user edits the files and user utilities provide additional functions. The kernel handles hardware access for input, output, and storage. So different Linux distributions have been made through time. So we have different distribution like Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, CentOS, Red Hat, Arch Linux, Manjaro, Linux Mint, OpenSUSE, Kali, Zorin. We can see that the main presenter are animals, especially from that use of penguins. So each distribution have its pros and cons and targeted audience. For example, Ubuntu, Manjaro, like those are distant for beginners or general users, those who try to use Linux for small tasks. For example, taking Fedora, for example, Debian are used for developers or for advanced users. CentOS is for enterprises. Red Hat. We have Kali Unix, which is used for security and cybersecurity and ethical hacking and so on. So different distributions are used, which is the main power of a Linux system. So finally, if you want to see what's the difference between Linux and other operating system, there is no better than Windows as an example. While, for example, Linux is open source, Windows is not. Linux is free, Windows is not. Linux is a highly customizable, Windows is so limited. Linux have a variety of desktop environments, but Windows have a standardized GUI, which is also a good thing in Windows, so that the users will not have a lot of changes, so it will be easy for them to continue with their previous knowledge, while in Linux you have different interfaces, so it will be hard to change from one distribution to the other. Linux is more secure, Windows need antiviruses. Updates Linux is so frequent, but not but it can be ignored. Windows, they are frequent but and regular, but are obligated. For example, the usage environment Linux can be used in servers, IoT, supercomputing, ATMs, and so on. Whereas Windows is for personal and enterprise workstations. For gaming, Linux is so limited, but Windows is more supports more modern games. For example, taking the ease of use, steeper learning curve for beginner, Windows is more user friendly and don't need a lot of training. So this is the main idea about this chapter. See you in the next chapter about command line usage and the hands-on Linux practice.